Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name's Emma Sears, and I'm going to be introducing our speaker for the day, Mary O'Hara. Before we begin, I'm just going to do a few reminders. Throughout this webinar, we would love for you all to access the chat button and interact throughout. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to write them in the chat. At the end, then I can read them out, or if any of you want to unmute yourselves and ask questions then, that is also great. This webinar also will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if any of you are uncomfortable with your names or your pictures on your Zoom being uploaded there, if you wouldn't mind just messaging me, and we would be happy to blur it out before we upload it. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out. Other than that, I believe we can have Mary start us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And thank you all for being here today. I'm really honored to be speaking with all of you. My background is in social work, and my practice has really focused on aging, specifically neurological disorders, and also mental health. And so this is a really important topic to me, and I think it's a really important topic that needs more exploration and more conversation and more of a collective understanding in our communities. So I'm really glad we get to do that together today. As Emma said, I would really love for all of you during my talk today to be connecting in the chat. Feel free to respond to some of the things I've said or share personal experiences that you would like to share related to some of the things I bring up today. I think it's another way for us to create that kind of connection that I'm going to be talking about. So my hope is really that you take away some ideas that you might integrate into your life and into your community moving forward. So this is what I'm going to be covering today. I really want to talk about the experience very generally of isolation, of social isolation, and then also of loneliness. And I want to talk about their relationships with our physical and our mental health. And then simultaneously understand the science of connection and what we know about how beneficial connection is to our physical and mental health. I want to talk about some initiatives that we have in response to loneliness and isolation. And then I want to specifically dive into the relationship between these things and Parkinson's disease and the impact of isolation, loneliness on Parkinson's disease. And then I want to leave a little bit of time to talk about how we can reduce isolation and loneliness and increase connection in the Parkinson's community here. So let's begin with the experience of social isolation. It really is a state of being. It's a very objective state of being, just this absence of social contact, being cut off from social networks. Maybe it's someone who's staying home for lengthy periods of time. Maybe they get out occasionally, but really for the most part, they are separate from any kind of community involvement, services, family, friends, or even acquaintances. Oftentimes with social isolation, once someone is reconnected, that isolation is reduced. It's no longer there. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that one can be socially isolated, but very content with that. Maybe they have a few meaningful relationships that they see on an occasional basis, and that is comfortable for them. They don't sense anything is missing. On the other hand, isolation can be something that leads to the experience of loneliness. So they are different concepts, and they're also quite interconnected. So the experience of loneliness is more of a subjective perception. It's not a state of being as much as it is a state of our minds. So when we feel lonely, we feel there is this gap between how connected we want to be with other people and how connected we feel we are. So, and it's really a lack of meaningful connection. So someone might be surrounded by a lot of people but still feel very lonely. It's also thought to be an alarm system, very deeply wired in our minds, that signals us to seek out connection, almost like hunger signals us to seek out food, or thirst to seek out water. It's thought to be this alarm system that helps us feel safe and secure. There are many different types of loneliness, and I'm not going to go into that today, but I just wanted to categorize a few. There's very transient loneliness or situational loneliness. Maybe on a rainy day, we feel lonely because we're trapped inside of our home with nowhere to go. It's really about short periods of time, that situational loneliness. But there's also a type of loneliness that we call chronic loneliness that really is more persistent, extending over a longer period of time. And it's really more internal to the person, feeling that the loneliness is always present. And then the philosophers would describe another type of loneliness called existential loneliness, which is more of a beyond chronic loneliness. These questions of, do I even fit into the universe? Does my life have meaning, purpose? And it's important to differentiate between these different types of loneliness, because how we would intervene if someone had transient loneliness, more situational loneliness, would obviously be different than someone who had chronic loneliness or more existential loneliness. It's also important to recognize that it's not one single emotion. It can be this cluster of feelings, and that can sometimes make it hard for people to recognize loneliness is what they're feeling. Sometimes it can present with anger. Sometimes it can present with sadness. So it can be this really quiet suffering that we might not even know that we're experiencing. Sometimes when I talk about loneliness, people will, a light bulb will kind of go off and say, oh, that's what that feeling is, or that's what that feeling was. We also recognize that loneliness begets loneliness. So it's really hard to climb out of that type of chronic loneliness. So invitations to join a book club or come out to dinner don't really easily address the issue. It can be a very vicious cycle, and I'll say more about that later on. It's also some believe that loneliness is even contagious, that it's something that can spread throughout social circles or even within a home if there's people living together. We have a lot of research around the determinants of health. It's thought to be as damaging. Loneliness is thought to be as damaging as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And it puts one at risk for certain mental health conditions like depression or anxiety, sleep problems, low self-esteem, and increased stress. And while feeling lonely is not in itself a mental health diagnosis, the two are very strongly linked. I did want to point out the practice of solitary confinement in some states in our prison system have outlawed this, have banished solitary confinement where someone is isolated because they have determined that it's cruel and unusual punishment. And I think that's important to think about when we think about someone being so isolated and alone, that can be used as a form of torture. That's how powerful and painful that is. And then finally, I wanted to really just introduce the idea of how difficult it is to measure loneliness. When we're studying loneliness, we know that we might not even be reaching the loneliest of the lonely. And so while we have scales and we have different tools we use to measure loneliness, everyone might define it a little bit differently and feel it a little bit differently. So it can be tricky to measure, but still really important to try. I couldn't go on with also not without recognizing these certain myths of isolation and loneliness that are out there, and the stigma of loneliness. There's sometimes these myths that someone who's lonely is just really introverted, or they're a loner, or someone who keeps to themselves is just really shy, or they have poor social skills, which we just know these things are not true. Even sharing with someone else that you're feeling lonely, there's a stigma there. We can be really afraid of being dismissed for that, or even blamed. Well, you don't reach out to people. So it can feel really invalidating, or it's difficult to express because people respond with, well, you should be so grateful. You have so many friends, you have neighbors. And that just really invalidates the experience. it can, when it's chronic, it can be very internalized. And so people start to believe there's something wrong with me. I'm flawed in some way because I feel this. And in that sense, the experience can be confusing. There can be this ambiguity that we feel. I am surrounded by a lot of people, but I do feel lonely. Why is what? That's really confusing. Those aren't lining up. And there can be this reluctance to acknowledge in our own experience that we might feel lonely because we're intent on living in a certain place or doing things a certain way. And again, like I said earlier, there can be so many misunderstood emotions that present in our experience of loneliness that are connected. So I wanted to just give a little bit of history of loneliness. There is so much loneliness and isolation that tends to be romanticized in music that we listen to, or in film or TV, or even religion. These characters that we are drawn to who are so painfully lonely, this is a common character in our entertainment. But the word itself, first, the term really crops up probably in around the 1800s. But before then, there was this term oneliness used, and it really referred to this solitude. It was simply the state of being alone. It was this time that one had with God. So it was thought to be very peaceful and very important. So there was no emotional lack. It was a necessary thing to do in order to reflect and be connected with your deepest thoughts. And if God was always nearby, you were never truly alone. But then we start to see loneliness burdened with associations of emptiness or absence of social connection. The term, there's in a glossary I came across of infrequently used words from 1674. Loneliness is really more defined like social isolation, meaning that you are far from neighbors. So as we start to see this word evolve in this time where the individual becomes so much more important and we start to separate from that social fabric, it starts to have this more negative connotation. And then fast forward to the 21st century and we see this experience of loneliness as an epidemic. And it's not surprising that our culture, embedded in our culture and in our country's story, is this isolation and this loneliness. Connection has been receding from our lives for a long time. There was one study that I looked at that asked people who are 70 and above how important they felt connection was in their community, being associated with other people. And they rated that very high. But for people who were of a younger cohort, age 16 to 25, they really rated associations with others in their community as much less important. So there's this decrease in importance of community in our culture. We know there's also reductions in marriage rates and smaller households, less people participating in clubs or in groups, falling rates of volunteerism, less religious affiliation. And we also see this rise in this digital culture. And some people blame some of this isolation on this rise in a digital world. I mean, we can go shopping, we can go grocery shopping from our homes, we can run errands from our homes for the most part. We can go for days without interacting with other people because of this digital world that we live in. But all of that speaks to this statistic that over 40% of adults over 65 feel lonely. And that's all older adults, not just any people living with Parkinson's disease. And that's a very, very high number. And yet when people are asked what makes life most meaningful to you, the answer is friends, meaningful relationships, connections with my family, people I love. So there's a puzzle here that we need to put back together between what makes life most meaningful and this loneliness that so many of us feel. So the science of loneliness is really fascinating. The science is really trying to reframe loneliness right now from this kind of state of profound despair to more of a understanding it as a very motivational force that's encoded in our biology. This idea that the pain of loneliness is thought to be a reminder for us to rejoin the pack, or we risk facing a predator all on our own. It's dangerous on the social perimeter, so we have to reconnect. And we've survived really as a species because of our social protection. So the pain of loneliness is thought to really motivate us to seek out others again, and that safety in that companionship and in that community. However, if we are unable to connect, we have evidence that this generates this fight or flight response inside of us, this stress response, that if unable to reconnect with our community or our society, we start to become more defensive. We start to pay more attention to the negative. We start to feel rejected by other people, and it's misinterpreted, even if that's not necessarily the case. We start to feel more vulnerable and just see more dangers out there. And as you can imagine, this makes it less likely for us to engage in meaningful ways if we are very defensive and only and we have this negative bias. So it harms our efforts to connect, and it also increases our stress, the cortisol. There's a theory that, loneliness has this very negative regulatory loop. So we are socially isolated. We are motivated to connect, but if we can't, we start to be hypervigilant to social threats. We start to see others as possibly threatening. We start to have a poor memory confirmation bias. So we start to remember experiences that we have had with others more negatively. And then, as you can imagine, this just plays out in a more negative experience for us the next time that we go to connect, and we start to push other people away. So it's this negative feedback loop that is generated when someone is experiencing that type of chronic loneliness. We also know that different regions of the brain are affected by this experience of loneliness. The prefrontal cortex, which is important in social behaviors and decision-making. People who identify as lonely have been found to have smaller brain volumes in that prefrontal cortex. Also, people who identify as lonely may experience smaller than normal hippocampus, and we know that that's connected to our learning and our memory. And then finally, the amygdala, which is more of this almond-shaped brown, illustrated here in the brain. There's thought to be a correlation between the size of a person's social network and the size of their amygdala. And the amygdala is important. This regulates our emotion and also is responsible for that fight or flight response, that stress response. So this is important because the lack of social interaction can really shine a light here on how it can impact our brains. So we know that isolation and loneliness may have many causes and many consequences. The beginnings can really be an interplay of some of these socio-demographic, even health factors listed here. So maybe it's a new diagnosis of something like Parkinson's disease, but it could also be something like widowhood or losing a meaningful role if a person's no longer working. There can also be psychosocial factors like being a caregiver can increase one's risk of loneliness. Having a mental health diagnosis, having hearing loss, mobility limitations are also risk factors for loneliness. And then also gender, race, and age are also include some risk factors for loneliness. And I think this is important to recognize not only as a community, but also especially for our healthcare providers so that if someone is presenting in their office as someone who maybe just had a new diagnosis, they've just moved, and they've just left their job, that these put them at risk for being lonely, and we need to intervene to prevent that from getting worse. And more than just loneliness, being really uncomfortable and just being an emotional pain, we know that it also has very serious psychiatric and physical consequences as well. Those are listed here. But there's good news too. It's not all bad news. We have so much more attention and awareness that we're paying to loneliness, especially in the wake of the pandemic. It's something that we're talking about much more. We're starting to do more research around this, and not only ways to cope with it and ways to intervene, but ways to prevent it in the first place. And I think this is a really important time, because we are all craving deeper forms of connection in our community life. And we have such a good understanding of the benefits of that social connection. So I think I wanted to share all of that with you, because knowing how we got here can also help us find our way back to deeper and more meaningful forms of connection, or find our way forward to that. So I'm sure you've heard this many times before, but there are many benefits to social connection, not just within our mood, but also better emotional regulation. It creates this positive feedback loop in our minds, just like I was describing a negative feedback loop that loneliness creates. Social connection creates a more positive feedback loop where we're reinforced to keep socially connecting. It also is thought to increase our immunity as well. It's thought to be a core psychological need. So how would we define social connection? Really, this very subjective experience of feeling close to other people, having a sense of belonging. It really is unrelated to the number of friends you have or the number of groups you're in. It can really just be about a few meaningful relationships. And interestingly enough, humans are meaning-making creatures. And so we can actually feel connection when it's not reciprocated. So for example, if I listen to the radio in the morning, I might have in my mind this relationship with the host of the radio show, or you might have a relationship with a character in a book or a character in a show. In your mind, you feel very connected with that person, even though you don't actually have a relationship. So I think it's a really interesting piece of understanding our social connection, is that we can have relationships in our mind that are very positive without actually having those relationships. We have research showing that people who participate in groups and clubs in religion do feel more socially connected. And as I mentioned, there's that positive feedback loop of social connection. There's some really interesting research by these two therapists. They're marriage and family therapists, the Gottmans, and they have identified what they call bids for connection, which they believe are these very fundamental roots of communication. So a bid for connection might be that I say to my husband, come sit with me on the couch, or come fold the laundry with me, or come on a walk with me, or sit down and have a cup of coffee with me. And the more he responds to those, the more I will keep putting out bids for connections. But if he doesn't respond to those, or every time I get a no, I can't, I'm too busy, sorry, no, I can't sit down with you right now, that creates disconnection. And then I just stop putting out those bids. You might also understand this in the context of friendships. If you're the one reaching out to say, hey, do you want to do something to a friend, and they just continuously turn you down or don't reply, you stop reaching out. And it's really a very simple concept, but they've got some really interesting research around bids for connection and how it leads to disconnection if we don't have those reciprocating bids happening. I think it's also important to think about how our rituals offer such connection, whether it's holidays or graduations or things that your family does, or even funerals or things like that we come together around a shared meaning and a shared purpose. This can offer such a sense of connection, and even when it takes a lot of effort to do those things or to get there. Or at a graduation, I'm thinking of, the park, getting there and the parking and sitting in the hot sun. It's still so important that we are coming together around those rituals, now that we can start to return to some of those things. So while they can be challenging sometimes to make happen, the next time you're invited to a ritual, just remember the importance of it for that social connection. So we have all this evidence that exercise and sleep and nutrition are so good for our bodies and our brains. Connection is just as important. It can help us regulate stress and anxiety, as I said. It can prevent against cognitive decline. It also is thought to boost endorphins, ease physical pain, enhance well-being. There are thought to be really important benefits to small talk. And that's something that COVID really took away from us when we couldn't have those conversations in the grocery store with someone or at the bank or in the places that we were passing people. So talk to strangers. There can be benefits just to those small, short, friendly conversations. Another tip I'll share is make your hugs a little bit longer. It's thought that at least a 7-second hug will help us release that oxytocin, that feel-good hormone. So linger in your hugs when you are comfortable doing that again. It's very good for our bodies and our minds. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some interventions that we have for loneliness. There's thought to be interventions on 3 different levels. There's this this community level, this environmental level, then there's group interventions, and then individual interventions to reduce isolation and loneliness. So the community level might look, an example of that might be something like the Village movement. In Denver here, we have A Little Help. Maybe it's an organization you've heard of, but it is a volunteer organization that supports people to age in their homes, to age in place. And so the volunteers come over and change a light bulb or help with computer problems or do some yard work so that it allows a person to stay connected in the community and also to stay in their home if that's important to them. Co-housing models are another example of these kind of community interventions. A co-housing model is a model where you have your own apartment, but then there's a shared living space of a kitchen and a dining room and a garden, so that you are coming together at regular times throughout the day to be in a community together. And then an example of a policy intervention on that level would be something like making hearing aids more affordable, knowing what we know about hearing loss and loneliness. Group interventions, maybe some of you have been part of some of the Parkinson's group programs, whether it's exercise in a group or a support group or a speech therapy group. These interventions we know are really significant in reducing isolation and loneliness. And then individual interventions might be for someone who's experiencing that type of chronic loneliness, who would benefit from some kind of short-term therapy. We do have evidence that cognitive behavioral therapy is an effective treatment for loneliness. And again, that's a short-term therapy really aimed at targeting a person's very negative thoughts and negative beliefs, and reframing those to allow for different thoughts and therefore different emotions about their experience. So we do have a number of different interventions that have been researched. We don't know which of these is most effective to intervene with loneliness, and we don't know why these are effective. Essentially, we can take a lot of guesses, but and we don't know enough to say if any of these are evidence-based, but we do have studies that have shown that they can reduce loneliness. So we talked about group exercise. Pets, either real or robotic, can also reduce loneliness. Mindfulness practices, volunteering, technology platforms that allow for greater ease with connecting with other people. Friendly calling programs or peer companions where there's a visitor coming out or calling, home delivered meals, and then also psychotherapy, like I just described, individual therapy. So there's another intervention that I'm going to say a little bit more about later on, but I did also want to mention it as an intervention. And this is called social prescribing. So this would be something that your physician would write a script for you to stay socially connected in these certain ways. Again, we just know that certain parts of the brain are activated in these kinds of social connections, and we want to preserve those parts of the brain and keep them as strong as possible. So, understandably, so many symptoms of Parkinson's really impact our ability to stay connected. They're not only the physical limitations, maybe even fears of falling or fears because of those physical limitations, but we can also, it's so common to see changes in motivation or changes in a person's initiative. Some people even experience that apathy. So it's more of apathy is better described as just not even having a feeling about something. So it's not that you want to go or don't want to go, you just don't have any feelings about it. We also know that there can be cognitive changes that can affect memory and speech and just processing information that would understandably result in someone choosing to stay home or just choosing to not want to explain themselves. So I think this is a really fundamental piece to recognize, that this disease creates ripe conditions for social isolation, and that's something that we're fighting against. Similarly, loneliness can change how you see yourself. Parkinson's can change how you see yourself. So if a person is experiencing this disease and then they start to sense this loss of identity, this loss of who they used to be, the loneliness can also impact how they see other people, what they expect of other people, how you view your interactions with other people, and your willingness to connect to other people. And we know that there is, again, a connection with mood, sadness, depression, and even anxiety. And it's really believed that loneliness is a key determinant in quality of life. We do have some research around that. So there is not a lot of research on Parkinson's disease and loneliness. However, what we do have is really examining the connections between quality of life and loneliness and symptom severity. So we do know that loneliness is correlated with greater symptom severity in people who identify as being lonely. We also know that depression correlates with social isolation in Parkinson's disease. People with Parkinson's disease who feel lonely were more likely to rate their disease as more severe. They rated their quality of life as lower than non-isolated people. And they exercise less and were less likely to follow healthy diets. Simultaneously, care partners also, 45% of care partners also experience loneliness, Parkinson's disease specifically, which I think is really important to acknowledge and talk about as well. This is an image I wanted to show you that illustrates that social health more strongly predicts quality of life than the severity of the tremor. So you can see on one side of this chart, someone who says they have a lot of friends also has the highest quality of life, but they may also have a very severe tremor. But someone who expresses that they have, that they are lonely on the other side of the chart, having a much poorer quality of life and yet a very similar severity of tremor. So I think that's really important to illustrate. So how do we begin? How do we reduce isolation? It's so important to start small. And maybe you think about it as, I'm just going to do 1 or 2 things a week to connect with other people. Just start where you are and start really small. And make it as easy as possible to go out or for people to come over. So maybe that means you have something by the door that has all of the things that you need to go on an outing for a few hours, and it just stays in that place. So before you go out, you're not looking all over the house for your wallet or your keys or your phone. Regularly scheduled programs can be a really helpful tool in staying connected with other people. People are expecting us to come, and you just have it on your calendar, and it just takes less effort for you to generate an idea of what should I do to stay connected with other people. You have this commitment on a regular basis. And I think with other people who understand is all the more supportive. I think it's also okay to invite others to be really flexible with plans or to come to you. You can say, yes, we'll make a lunch date this week, but sometimes I have really bad days and I might not be able to come. If that's the case, would you just come over later in the day for a cup of tea? Or tell them up front that, if this has been happening lately, invite them to be flexible so that it doesn't mean you don't see them at all. The plans are just modified. And along those lines, don't be afraid to share the limitations that you have right now, and also share your strengths, what's still going okay and what you still feel comfortable with doing. I think sometimes people don't know, and so they either make assumptions or they're just uncomfortable, and so they don't know how to respond. And that may mean that they're less likely to continue to reach out. It's also along these lines of sharing, remind other people who are close to you what really matters most to you right now. And if staying connected with them is something that is really important to you, let them know that. They need to hear that, because this time is really about what you value most. Talk about this. Talk about the dangers of isolation and loneliness. Ask if other people have ever experienced loneliness or felt this isolation creep in. Social prescribing is another way to reduce isolation that I mentioned earlier, and that I want to show you a visual on in a moment, where that's really our physicians and our other providers saying, as important as exercise and sleep and a healthy diet and your medications, you have to be staying connected with other people. This is a prescription. In the chat, I'd love for you all to share ways that you are connecting right now, or things that you have found really supportive that have really helped you stay connected, even when it feels really hard to do that. So this is this image I wanted to show you about social prescribing. So you can see at the top, social isolation. A person is cut off socially from others. The stress response is activated. That's what that is. Increased cortisol. Our immunity starts to become affected. Our sleep starts to be disrupted. We have worse PD symptoms, both motor and non-motor. We start to experience increase in apathy, depression, anxiety, and then we have less interest in social connection. And social prescribing is thought to be a disruptor of this very vicious cycle. So how would we treat loneliness? As I said earlier, it's not as simple as saying, come join my book club or come out to dinner, because when the person goes back home, they're going to feel lonely again, because loneliness is such a personal experience and such a perception. What we need to do is help that person start to change some of their very negative thoughts, start to reframe some of those perceptions. And we can do that with cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, it's a short-term treatment. So I would really encourage people to find help through therapy if they are feeling that they're experiencing loneliness. talking about it again with other people, not being afraid to be vulnerable and sharing this concern about yourself or about someone else. And I think finally, being really kind to yourself in this time. We tend to be really hard on ourselves and beat ourselves up when something's not going well. And so part of treating our loneliness is also being really gentle with ourselves in this difficult time. I use quite a bit of mindfulness in my practice. And so I just wanted to go through just an example with you. So one thing we might begin with is this idea of acceptance, that accepting that this loneliness is here right now. Not that you're okay with it, but just seeing it for what it is, seeing that it belongs here right now, that it's allowed because of what's going on. And I think at the same time also acknowledging the pain of this. This really hurts and this is really hard. But acknowledge that without any judgment of yourself or others, without any blame of yourself or others or criticism. Instead, attending to it with a little bit of kindness, that I'm doing my best right now. I'm going to take care of myself the best I can. Challenging some of those negative thoughts would include really being aware of any story that you're telling yourself about the situation. So maybe the story you have in your mind is how one of your friends isn't reaching out anymore. They're off doing something else and they're no longer close with you or no longer care about you as much. That's a story you've made up in your mind that might not be based in fact. And I think along those lines, explore your expectations of other people. Do you have an idea of what other people should be doing for you right now or should be for you right now? Is there even a should of your friendships? What might be your expectations of other people right now? And along that vein is also searching for the good in those people as well, especially people that you were once very close with that maybe aren't seeing as often. What are some of the good things about them right now so that we don't lose sight of that? I would also ask people to be really curious about their role, about any armor that they've put up, any blind spots that they may have that might suggest that they have some responsibility to reach out, not always waiting for other people to come to you. And asking this question, instead of why am I lonely, the question is really what's creating this dynamic right now that I can control? Where do I have some agency that I can make some small changes to improve this situation? And then finally, I think using our values to guide us in situations like these are a really simple and effective tool. So we can transform this experience into recognizing what we really need. What does the pain of loneliness tell you that you need right now? What's most important to you? What is it pointing you to? Maybe it's pointing you to reach out to some friends that you've lost touch with. Maybe it's pointing you to spending a little bit more, wanting to spend more time with a certain person in your life. And can those values, what you value most in this life, can they guide you into action? And again, something small, starting small is really important. And then finally, a dose of self-compassion. Again, we can be so hard on ourselves. So to acknowledge we're doing the best we can is a really important part of a mindful approach. And then finally, what does meaningful connection ask of us? You know, it asks us to be vulnerable. If we want people to be real with us, we have to be real with them, and we have to tell them what we're really thinking and feeling. And that's vulnerable, and that's okay. It really does create meaningful connection and deep connection with others. I think also accepting things for what they are, recognizing that it's not what you wanted, but it is what is right now. Being comfortable with silence. It doesn't always have to be filled with talk or noise. That silence is okay too. Not having any comparisons to other people or really trying to reduce our judgments of a situation or other people. They should have done this, or he's doing all this and I don't get to. And really keeping in check our expectations of other people or of a certain situation, because they often just lead to our disappointment. And finally, not making assumptions about other people's behaviors. We can easily do that as well. Again, making up a story in our minds about what someone else is thinking. So, deepening connections today. I really encourage you to stay proactive about social connection each day. Maybe even look on your calendar and see what's coming up next. That would allow you to stay connected with other people. And if it's not in the next few days, reach out to someone and make a date. You also, your mental health is really important, and you don't have to feel lonely, and help is available. And so I do hope you reach out to your doctor or provider to find a referral to someone who can work with you around your loneliness. Your mental health really matters again. I encourage you to talk about loneliness, talk about the importance of connection, the impact on the brain, the impact on our physical well-being among your communities, but also join the conversations in the PD community about addressing loneliness, or start them if they're not existing right now. I want you to really bring this lens to recognize loneliness in other people that might be in your life, who might be at risk for isolation or loneliness. Reach out, talk to strangers, say hello to people at the grocery store again, have those 30-second conversations again, and the 7-second hugs at least. Again, those are going to release that oxytocin, those feel-good hormones. And finally, maybe there is some, after this really difficult year and a half, maybe there is some post-traumatic growth. Maybe there is even deeper connection on the other side of this experience. And I hope that's something we all experience. So thank you so much. I would love to leave a little bit of time for questions. Maybe I'll stop sharing and we can all see each other.
Thank you so much, Mary. Right now, there are no questions in the chat, but again, all of you feel free, and then, or just unmute yourselves.
I guess I covered everything.
Mary, my machine went down when you were talking about the 24/7. Oh no, the 7:30-second hug.
Yes. So
I didn't get to hear.
So what I said there was that you should linger in your hugs when you're hugging someone. Make sure that it's at least 7 seconds long, because that's the amount of time that we need to release that oxytocin, those feel-good hormones. So instead of just a brief hug, hold on a little bit longer. That's good for social connection.
Thank you. I love
But let
that.
go eventually when the other person pulls away, I guess.
That begins to look a little weird.
Yeah, it does. It's awkward.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is Paul Zeiger. I'm now connected. Am I audible?
Yes.
I wanted to put in a plug for Trimble Clefs. We're struggling to get it started again after the lockdown. But singing together is a wonderful way to build a relationship.
Yes.
Some of us have appreciated that a lot.
Yes. I didn't include specific groups that I know are around Denver, because I know all of you are connected with PAR, probably have access to all of those. But please, thank you for saying that, Paul. I think it's also, as things are starting to reopen and people are eager to connect, music is a wonderful way to feel that sense of connection. And it's just, it makes people so happy. So it's great for the brain.
We missed the first half hour. Is this recorded at all, that we could listen to the full session?
Yeah, this will be recorded and then uploaded to our YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Any other questions or even just reflections on on loneliness in your experience or any of the concepts that I introduced today? Maybe how hard it is?
We've had an interesting experience recently. My husband has noted that when he calls people to do something, go on a walk or a bike ride or whatever, they invariably say, "Oh, I've been thinking about calling you," or "I'm so glad you called. I don't know why I haven't picked up the phone, but I haven't." And it always works that way somehow, that he does the calling, and it turns out I've done the same thing. And I was talking with another friend at a picnic, and she said the same thing happens to her. She calls and people invariably say, "Oh, I'm so glad you called," but they never call themselves.
Isn't that interesting?
Very
How do
cool.
you explain that? How do you make sense of that?
Laziness, I don't know. It has nothing to do with the PD factor.
Yeah.
These are people that, aren't in that community, but it's like maybe we're afraid of being rejected.
Hmm.
Or, you call people and they say they either don't answer, don't call back, or somehow indicate that they don't want to participate, or
Yeah.
you think that's what they're saying by not calling back, but you don't know for sure.
I think we often try to avoid those uncomfortable situations, whether it's worrying about being rejected or not knowing what exactly to say. That maybe that's an explanation, is that people have just avoided calling, and maybe they don't even know why.
That's possible. Yeah. It's frustrating.
Yeah. Well, if there are questions that come up later, I hope you will ask them of your friends and families and in your groups. Again, this is a really important ongoing conversation, I think, especially in this community. So I hope you took away some things today that you can bring to your close friends and family and talk about a little bit more. And your
Thank you.
doctors.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. Take care, be well. Linger in those hugs.
All right, I
Oh,
hope
let me-
everyone.
No, I could add one more comment on the presentation as a whole. My wife of 50 years is a PhD psychologist, so there was not material here there was not much that was new to me. But what it did do that I didn't expect was make me aware of the size and weight of the effects of loneliness, that I hadn't thought about the whole pile together. And it makes me now take more seriously.
Well,
That's
thank
all.
you. Thank you, Paul, for sharing that. Yes, continue to talk about this so that we spread this throughout the community. And we collectively are doing more to minimize the effects and minimize the experience. So thank you all so much. It was good to see you this afternoon. Take care and be well.
Thank you so much, Mary. You all have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.